By 1876, an entire people had been wiped from the face of the earth. Not by plague, not by famine, by policy. The British colonial government looked at what had been done to the Aboriginal people of Tasmania and called it a success. They wrote reports about it. They gave speeches about it. And then, slowly, deliberately, they stopped talking about it altogether. What you are about to hear is not a story history forgot. It is a story history chose not to tell. And there is a difference. The island sits at the bottom of the world, separated from mainland Australia by the Bass Strait, battered by winds that have crossed thousands of miles of open ocean before hitting its western cliffs. The British called it Van Diemen's Land when they arrived. Today, we call it Tasmania. But long before any European ship appeared on the horizon, this land had a name. It had people. It had history. 35,000 years of it. This is the story of the Palawa people, of what was done to them in broad daylight by a government that kept careful records, and of how the world spent over a century pretending none of it happened. When the first British settlers landed on Van Diemen's Land in 1803, they encountered a civilization that had existed longer than almost any other on Earth. The Palawa, the Aboriginal people of Tasmania, had lived on this island for at least 35,000 years. That number is almost impossible to absorb. To put it in context, when the Palawa first walked these lands, humans had not yet reached Europe in any significant number. The pyramids would not be built for another 30,000 years. The oldest known written language was still 25,000 years away. And yet here they were, thriving. The Palawa were not a single uniform group. They were organized into 9 distinct nations, each with its own territory, its own dialect, its own complex system of law and trade. They hunted kangaroo and wallaby on the interior plains. They harvested shellfish and kelp along the coastline. They burned sections of bush in controlled patterns to manage the land, a practice so sophisticated that modern ecologists have only recently begun to fully understand it. Their population at the time of British contact is estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 15,000 people. Historians debate the exact number, but what no one debates is what happened to that number in the decades that followed. It went to 0. But the killing did not start with soldiers and government orders. It started earlier and quieter. In the years before formal colonization, European sealers and whalers had already begun operating along the Tasmanian coast. They took what they wanted from the land, and they took what they wanted from the people. Aboriginal women were kidnapped from their communities, taken as forced labor, as sexual property, as servants on isolated island outposts. Men who tried to resist were shot. The colonial administration in Sydney knew this was happening. They issued a few weak protests. Nothing changed. By the time the British established their formal settlement at Hobart in 1804, the Palawa were already living in a world that had begun to close around them. Their waterholes were being fenced off. Their hunting grounds were being converted to farmland. Diseases, Smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis were spreading through communities that had no immunity to any of them. The world the Palawa had maintained for 35,000 years was being dismantled, piece by piece, with bureaucratic efficiency. And no one in London lost a moment's sleep over it. In 1824, the violence stopped being informal. That year, the colonial government of Van Diemen's Land officially declared a state of conflict with the Aboriginal population. What followed between 1824 and 1831 is known today as the Black War. It was not a war in any conventional sense. There were no two armies. There were no negotiations. There were no terms. There was only a government with guns and a people trying to survive. Governor George Arthur, who took control of the colony in 1824, was not an irrational man. That is precisely what makes what he did so disturbing. He was organized, methodical, and deeply convinced that what he was doing was necessary. In 1830, he issued what became known as the Proclamation Boards, crude illustrated panels distributed across the colony, depicting Aboriginals and settlers standing as equals before British law. They were a lie wrapped in the language of fairness. Because below those boards, in the same year, Arthur placed a bounty on Aboriginal people. £5 for every adult captured, £2 for every child. The same government that claimed equality in its illustrations was paying its settlers to hunt human beings for money. But the single most chilling act of the Black War was what became known as the Black Line. In October 1830, Arthur mobilized over 2,200 soldiers, settlers, and convicts in a coordinated human dragnet, a literal line of armed men stretching across the island, designed to sweep the surviving Aboriginal population into a corner of the peninsula and capture or destroy them. The operation lasted 7 weeks. It cost the colonial government what would today be millions of dollars. It crossed mountains, rivers, and dense bush. It captured 2 people. The Black Line was a military failure, but it was something else entirely in terms of what it revealed about the colonial mindset. This was not frontier violence, not spontaneous brutality. This was a government operation funded by public money, staffed by ordinary men, aimed at the systematic removal of a people from their own land. Meanwhile, settlers who operated outside the official campaign needed no legal authority. They poisoned water holes. They laced flour with arsenic and left it where Aboriginal communities would find it. They shot men on sight. They burned shelters. Their diaries recorded these acts without shame, sometimes with pride. The Black War did not end because the colonists had a change of heart. It ended because there were almost no Palawa left to fight. What came next was dressed in the language of mercy. It may have been the most devastating chapter of all. His name was George Augustus Robinson. He called himself a humanitarian. He spoke of protecting the Aboriginal people from the violence of the settlers. Beginning in 1829, Robinson undertook what he called the Friendly Mission, traveling across Van Diemen's Land contacting surviving Palawa communities and persuading them, through interpreters and promises, to surrender. He promised them safety. He promised them land. He promised them that if they came with him, the killing would stop. They believed him. They had no reason to. Between 1831 and 1834, the surviving Palawa, approximately 200 people, the last remnant of a civilization that had existed for 35,000 years, were transported to Flinders Island, a windswept, treeless outcrop in the Bass Strait. The settlement was named Wybalenna. In the Palawa language, it means black man's houses. What Robinson built there was not a refuge. It was a slow execution.
The shelters were cold and poorly constructed. The food provided was inadequate and foreign to everything the Palawa had eaten for thousands of years. European diseases, the same ones that had already devastated their communities on the mainland, continued to spread through the settlement unchecked. The British administrators banned the Palawa from speaking their own languages. They forced Christian conversion. They dressed the survivors in European clothing, gave them English names, and systematically dismantled every cultural practice that had defined their identity. They called this civilization. The Palawa called it something else. But by then, they were dying too fast to call it anything at all. When Robinson arrived at Wybalenna with his 200 survivors, he believed he was saving a people. By 1847, only 47 remained. 47 people. From a civilization of thousands, sustained across 35,000 years, to 47 souls in 16 years. In 1847, the survivors were moved again, this time to Oyster Cove on the Tasmanian mainland. The conditions were, somehow, worse. There was no meaningful medical care. The government's attention had moved on. The Palawa were left to disappear quietly. One by one, they did. The last known full-blooded Palawa woman was a woman named Truganini. She had watched her mother be killed by sailors, her husband murdered in front of her, her people dismantled piece by piece across the course of her lifetime. She died on May 8th, 1876, in Hobart. She was approximately 64 years old. Before she died, Truganini made one request. She asked not to be cut apart after her death. She had seen what the colonists did with Aboriginal remains, collected them, measured them, displayed them as curiosities. 2 years after her death, her skeleton was exhumed, reconstructed, and placed on public display in the Tasmanian Museum. It remained there until 1947. The genocide of the Palawa people did not end with Truganini's death. It continued in a different form, with different weapons. For over a century after 1876, the official position of the Tasmanian colonial and later state government was simple. The Aboriginal Tasmanians were extinct. Gone. Finished. This was not a conclusion reluctantly reached. It was a narrative aggressively promoted, and it served a very specific purpose. If the Palawa were extinct, there were no descendants to claim land rights. There were no survivors to demand justice.
There were no living people to contradict the story the government had been telling about inevitable, tragic, but ultimately natural disappearance. The extinction narrative was not a historical assessment. It was a legal strategy. The problem was that it was not true. Aboriginal Tasmanian women who had been taken by European sealers in the early 1800s had borne children. Those children had children. Communities of mixed Aboriginal and European descent had formed on the Bass Strait Islands, Flinders Island among them, and they had maintained cultural memory, family ties, and identity across generations. By the late 20th century, the Tasmanian Aboriginal community numbered in the tens of thousands. But for most of the 1900s, the government refused to recognize them. Aboriginal Tasmanians were told by official institutions and public discourse alike that they did not exist, that their identity was a fiction, their culture was lost, their claims had no basis. It was, in a precise and terrible sense, a continuation of the original project. First, you remove the people. Then you remove the memory of the people. Then you remove the people who remember.
The fight back was long and exhausting. It was fought in courtrooms, in parliaments, in academic journals, and in the streets. In 1976, exactly 100 years after Truganini's death, her remains were finally cremated and her ashes scattered on the D'Entrecasteaux Channel, as she had originally wished. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued a formal national apology to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, an apology that explicitly named the policies of forced removal and cultural destruction that had shaped Australian history. But the reckoning was never truly complete. Human remains of Aboriginal Tasmanians, taken by European scientists and collectors throughout the 19th century, transported to museums in London, Edinburgh, and across the continent, are still being sought for repatriation today. Cultural artifacts, ceremonial objects, and stolen knowledge sit in foreign institutions, catalogued under colonial classification systems. And the story itself, the full, documented, unflinching story of what happened to the Palawa people, is still absent from most history curricula, still softened, still described, when it is described at all, as a tragic inevitability rather than what it was. A choice made by real people, recorded in writing, never truly punished.
History does not bury itself. People bury it. Governments bury it. Institutions protect it with silence, with redirection, with the slow erosion of inconvenient facts from official memory. The Palawa people of Tasmania were not a footnote. They were a civilization, one of the oldest sustained human cultures ever to exist on this planet, and they were systematically destroyed within a single lifetime by a government that kept detailed records and faced no meaningful consequences. The Tasmanian Aboriginal community is still here, still fighting, still demanding that the full truth be spoken out loud, in classrooms, in parliaments, in the places where history is officially decided. The least the rest of the world can do is listen. This was buried history. The story they hoped you'd never find.